Hi. Well, I'm another stranger to this environment. I'm a medieval historian, and I did ask my scientific colleagues about science conferences and what people did at them, and they said no scripts. But after a bit, they were very insistent that there were no scripts and it was only PowerPoint. And after a bit, they said, but we do prepare our papers in a slightly anxious way. So I have tried to do both things, not to have a script and to prepare something. But what I'm going to suggest is probably going to sound a bit odd, and I feel that saying it to scientists is probably about the oddest place I could possibly say it, but let's see how we go. So as we know, there are many constraints on responses to what I'm going to call the science. So a very established consensus that there's, I suspect very few people really doubt, even if they say that they do for various reasons. And I wanted to just point to a few, I think it's probably pretty familiar, political inaction, which is licensed by public refusal to engage. So as long as people aren't demanding action of politicians, as long as most people aren't demanding action from politicians, then politicians are very comfortable with not doing much about it. And I think that it's important to note that public disengagement manifests itself in various ways. And I think probably the most common way is to say, yes, of course, I believe in the science. Believing in science is an interesting way of putting it. It's quite a religious way of putting it. But I think also believing in science but then not really doing anything about it is probably, I think we should probably start calling it a form of denial, even if that's an uncomfortable thing to say. But I also think that focusing on individual actions, which we've all been encouraged to do as a sort of main strategy of response, is probably, well, it's obviously not enough, but it's probably also verging on denial that this is a major political problem and a major social problem that needs to be dealt with on a much larger scale than individual actions can do. I think education's another quite important factor here that we need to be paying more attention to. Now, obviously, we can teach in the universities if we're university teachers, but education needs to start a great deal earlier than that. And I think questions about what sort of critical thinking is being taught in schools from the earliest years. Is critical thinking being taught in the schools, and what does it look like? And can we help with that? What about interdisciplinarity, where the school students are corralled into classes to learn different disciplines? How is that connected up? Are there any ways that we can start helping schools, both primary and secondary, to connect up things so that people can do the sort of critical thinking across disciplines that ordinary citizens need to be able to do if this is going to become a political issue? And I think probably the same questions need to be asked in universities. I've been hearing interesting disjunctions between which scientists talk to each other, which don't. As a medieval historian, I'm very aware that absolutely no one is seeking me out to talk to me about climate change, even though, as you'll see, I have some things to say about it. And I think just the final point that I want to raise here, that and this is obviously the one where I think that historians are fairly essential, public understanding of what humans and human societies are, where they've come from, where they're going. It sort of sounds trivial in a way, but it's actually incredibly fundamental for how we think about ourselves. And if you think back to the history that you were taught at school, maybe you dropped it as soon as you possibly could. But there is a kind of base historical narrative that we understand ourselves through. And in the UK, I guess it's fair to say that we don't talk about the empire very much, but we do talk about how we defeated the Nazis. This gives us a particular sense of ourselves. We could reverse that sense of ourselves if we talked a lot about the empire and didn't say too much about the Nazis. However, I think that what historians can do is to change our sense of the past, and I think this is something that hasn't really been explored outside possibly questions of empire, which is a growing movement in history in some ways. But I want to tackle the most fundamental underlying historical narrative today. There are all sorts of different ways that one can complicate this and make it a bit more subtle. I've got 20 minutes, so I'm not going to be terribly subtle. The ideology of progress, this is what Western society in particular bases itself on, and all Westernizing societies, or Westernized societies, which is pretty much everyone, because we have a very coercive way of making people become Westernized. Most societies now see themselves as somewhere on a linear narrative of progress. And human history, therefore, becomes a trajectory towards our present, to where we are now. So we're globalized, we're mostly Westernized, we're mostly capitalist, we're what we're calling democratic nation states. This is where the whole direction of history has gone. And because this is a sort of benign outcome, this is the way it's presented, we see that the best and brightest humans over the centuries have drawn us in this direction, and that essentially this is better than what we had before. This is a view of history that's being slightly eroded at the moment, I think, but it's stood pretty strong throughout most of my lifetime, and I think it hasn't gone anywhere yet. I think it's still pretty robust. There are a couple of self-protective elements in this. So there's also the notion of ruptures and leaps forward. So the Enlightenment's a sort of classic one. I guess the scientific revolution is another. So moments at which things have changed quite dramatically and humans have improved rather fast over time. And these ruptures, I think, hide a lot of continuities of thought. So the Enlightenment and I suppose the scientific revolution is supposed to have changed the way we thought. And similarly with movements like secularization, which are supposed to have changed quite dramatically how we thought. But I think if you sort of peel back the language of difference, you find very strong continuities in how we've thought over the centuries. And I think for that reason, in order to understand why we're here now, we need to go back as far as we can to see these ideas and to slightly resist the notion that they have changed dramatically at any point. And the other, this is a bigger safety valve actually in the progress narrative. The idea that it's possible to go backwards for some periods and then retrieve the situation. So as a medieval historian, by the way, medieval historians hate the idea of the medieval. We're just a bit stuck with it though. But it's a sort of delegitimized space. So it runs from about 500 to 1500. And this is the period after the fall of the Roman Empire and before, everyone managed to get their act together around 1500 with the discovery of the Americas. And so medieval works historically as a sort of delegitimized space. Things weren't happening in the right way there and then. But it's also, as you know, a political category. We must invade Iran because it's medieval. Now Iran is here now being modern, but actually, if you want to make that kind of argument about it, or if you want to delegitimize a form of behavior that's happening now, you tend to say it's medieval. You remove it from the narrative of what we are as modern people and put it into a separate category where it doesn't really count. And we see this used in various ways. And so I think that various of our sort of fundamental concepts that we see as virtuous concepts are very much embedded in this narrative. So particularly the concept of being progressive means it ties progressive behavior into this sense that things are continually improving or ought to be continually improving. And of course growth is clearly part of this as well. And I think even people who want to be critical of our society in even very thorough ways would like to say that it's not being as progressive as it should be, or it's not making the progress that it should, or the progress is going in the wrong direction, but proper progress would go in the right direction. So I think that we're really stuck with this idea at the moment. Why is this a problem? So I think it does moralize one particular trajectory, and it celebrates it. It's a triumph. So the triumph of humanity is this path from the earliest humans right through to our final and complete triumph over nature. And in the process of doing this, it selects various characteristics about human societies and human behavior as either progressive characteristics or backwards ones. And there are I've put some various pairs here. It depends a bit which period you're looking at, how meaningful they are. But sedentary better than nomadic, agriculture better than pastoralism, civilization definitely better than barbarism, states better than not being properly governed, rational, which is I think a big one for people in the room here, definitely better than irrational. Not very many questions asked about who gets to decide what's rational. And on what terms, and are they by any chance the most powerful people in a society? Urban and rural, another pairing, centre often better than locality, and economy often more important than than ecologies. And I think that what this does is lock us into a future that's more of the same. So one point that I want to make as a historian, I think this is actually really important. I think it's really important to understand that this way of seeing things is really old. This is not a product of the Enlightenment. It's millennia old, and it's always been designed to lock into a future that's more of the same. The kind of societies that produce these narratives are powerful states that are attempting to expand their rule and to solidify the power of their elites and to maximize the resources they're extracting. And we can see this as far back. I say this as medieval historian rather than archaeologist, but I think that we can probably see this as far back as we've got societies that leave enough of an imprint in history to tell us what they thought. So just to give some quick sense of this, this is Wikipedia's idea of what the world looked like in 1000 BC. What I want to draw your attention to is not so much the details of it, but the very small part of that map that is actually a state space. So the rest of it, I mean, this is obviously quite speculative, but the rest of this is not. It's not organized in state forms. So if we take a pretty early state, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, which if anyone's been to the British Museum has left absolutely extraordinarily beautiful things which you see as soon as you walk in. But what we see in this celebration of the power of the state, so these are reliefs that are taken from the imperial palace. So we see dominion over wild animals. The lion up there is being knifed by the Shah. We see the domestication of animals. we see coerced human labour. So I don't know how well you can see it, but these humans are yoked to what they're pulling along. And we see logging here, so this is cut down trees being shipped back. This was, at the time, the biggest land empire. So what you're seeing on this map is the expansion of the empire. And so if you think about the ideologies that you need to expand like that, with particularly the technologies of the time, these are fierce ideologies, and they do involve extraction of resources on a larger and larger scale. And so this celebrates the conquest. This is from an obelisk that celebrates the conquest. So here we have prisoners captured in war, ranks and ranks of prisoners all captured in war. These are all human beings who've now become probably slave labor, certainly coerced labor tied to the land. And then we see also the submissions of kings. And this obelisk has a whole series of kings submitting in much this position. So if we fast forward to the 12th century, when the English are thinking about conquering Ireland, this is from a book that Gerald of Wales, a bishop, wrote to King Henry of England to persuade him to resume the conquest of Ireland, which had been interrupted. And he presents the Irish in a particular way. And what I'd like to emphasize here is that he's presenting the Irish as very close to nature, very, very barbaric. And so we have bestiality on the top left-hand corner. We have people killing each other under trees. We have a bearded woman. I'm not quite sure why that struck me as being close to nature, but somehow it did. And we also have a pagan kingship ritual, which is just not how you consecrate kings if you're a civilized person. And the whole book is, he kind of enjoys all this. These are funny stories, and he manages to Christianize this. There's a lot of sort of holy birds and whatnot. But his underlying point is that these people aren't agrarian. They've got this very rich, fertile landscape, and they're just not doing anything about it. They don't want to work hard, he says. They don't want to farm the land. They don't want to make it fertile. They don't want to do any of the things that civilized people do, and therefore they should be invaded. And we hear this argument again and again. It's sort of famously used to justify settling Australia, empty land. No one's doing anything with it. But I think that the point I'd like to make here is not so much about the empty land as about the connection with nature. So there are clearly people here, but they're embedded in nature, and they're therefore they're not doing what they should be doing. So I think that, and so particularly in Europe, and I'm a specialist of Europe, so I'm going to talk about that, but I think that these points can be made quite well with other large state and expanding states in this period. It's China, for example, had deforested a lot of northern China about the time that Rome fell. There was already significant deforestation and soil erosion. But and I think these kinds of arguments are made more widely than just in Europe. However, in Europe, the big narrative about the Christianization of Europe, you may be aware of this, is the chopping down of sacred trees and the destroying of pagan shrines. So what we have here is a sort of a classic picture of the rational, civilized people moving in and chopping down the trees. And I think that the more that a population's associated with being in harmony with its local ecology, the less rational it looks, and the less seriously it's taken. So there's no sense that these people have their own way of doing things that should be respected and left alone. It's definitely inferior. They should definitely be converted to Christianity. And so I think that this sense, the reason I'm talking about this to you today is because I think that this sense of where rationality lies, and that it doesn't lie with being too embedded in nature and too sensitive to nature's rhythms, and to the wider environment and ecosystems and the possibilities and experience of biodiversity. I think that sense that is not rational is something that climate scientists and others who've been trying to alert people to the problems have faced in various ways. And I mean, it's very clearly been a part of the reaction to the Gaia sort of proposals. And that's very hard to counter, I think, unless we're exposing these histories as part of a process of making a state. So if you want to take a landscape and you want to exploit its resources and you want to put its people into coerced labor, which is basically the situation across all these large-scale empires, you need to have a narrative about why it's not okay to be embedded in nature in this way. And I think one of the things that's quite striking here is that a sacred tree is an ambiguous thing. We don't quite know what they were doing with it, but what does that mean? How can you engage with it if you're an invading state? What can you do with the tree? There's not very much you can do with it, but if you've got a monotheistic God whose church you control, you can do an awful lot with that to tell people what they should think and to direct their loyalties in the direction that you'd like it to be taken. So this linear narrative, which also it sort of degrades connections with nature, locks us into a future that looks more of the same. So I mean, there are plenty of these sorts of images around. But we have either a future that's got nature very contained, it's certainly present, or one where nature's taken over and humans are gone. And that's awfully close to a Christian sort of view of things, salvation, damnation. You notice the highly ordered space at the top and the chaotic, particularly the hell at the bottom. But this is Earth down here, and it's a bit of a mess. So what can historians do to help with this? There's a really interesting new field, I don't know how many of you are aware of it, of environmental history, and more and more books are just pouring out in the last 5 years that are taking this massive climate and environment, historical climate and environmental data that historians we've never been able to know these things until people wanted to understand about past climates and past environments. And historians are still a bit unsettled by this. A lot of historians are practically rejecting it. They're very worried about what it does to human agency and is this determinism and these sorts of problems. These are problems for my discipline to work out. I won't bother you with them too much. But it is a very exciting field, and all sorts of interesting theses are coming out of it. And particularly when it's read against historic sources of the kind that we're more used to using, it offers quite interesting sidelights onto problems and sometimes quite large-scale explanations. Did Rome fall because of barbarians, or did Rome fall because of climate shifts combined with all sorts of other environmental factors? Very new arguments of the kind that we haven't had until fairly recently. The other thing, which is what I want to talk about for my remaining time, is another aspect of this. So what I'm proposing is attentive to environmental history, but is not actually environmental history, which is developing new narratives that are trying to propose ways of reimagining the human past and just shifting the emphases of this kind of state-driven history that we're all locked into, and looking more at what kind of past that would be usable for us to imagine a future differently, to break this sense of continuity of development and growth, so we can challenge all our assumptions about what we were and what we could be. And I can't emphasize enough that when I'm saying that these are things developed by states, they are developed by states for the purposes of the elites who are extracting the resources of the states. These aren't benign narratives that are designed to help and include everyone. And I think that we must keep that in mind. These are already political narratives, but they disguise themselves as truths. This is just to give you an indication of some of the interesting environmental history that's emerging. So just some things to consider for new narratives. So I think avoiding the language of development to describe change. So historians are awfully keen on looking at development, what developed from this and what developed from that. So giving attention to what's lost as well as what's gained each time things change. I'm not suggesting a nostalgic view of the past at all. I'm suggesting a kind of clear-eyed view of just what a change meant. So, for example, if state power grows, at the moment you get lots of student essays saying, excellent, that state became stronger. There's no sense of looking at what local autonomies and what local possibilities were lost as that state became stronger. And similarly, what is a state doing as it becomes stronger? There's a very interesting book by James C. Scott called Seeing Like a State that looks at the way the state consciously simplifies environments and social organizations in order to be able to see and count and extract. Monocropping, he links to this. If you just grow one kind of grain, you can predict how much you're going to get for taxation purposes. Monotheism, I think, is another very effective way of doing this, as I've said before. And I think the maybe another very difficult and important thing for historians to start to be able to do is to situate human societies within very complex and dynamic ecosystems and earth systems, rather than seeing them as uniquely imbued with human agency. Most of the time we say, oh, this happened because this ruler decided it should. To include this whole vast kind of forgotten world in which the ruler was acting, I think would be quite a big change to how history is done and how we understand our past. I think we need to take a lot more critical attentiveness to when we're looking at categories. So a very well-used quotation, it matters what ideas one uses to think of other ideas with. So if we are thinking about progress and we're looking at progress, we're missing a whole lot of things. And the same with a whole set of other sort of key ideas like rationality. When we're saying something's rational, we need to think a little bit more about why we think that thing's rational and who said it was and what other things might be, whether they might be equally rational or even more so. So sort of in keeping with this, I think we need to keep asking why we're seeing things the way we do. And I think we do need this very long history. So there is work on this, but a lot of it either deals with very ancient grain states or it starts with either for sort of 1500 or with industrialization. But I think that it's quite fundamental to look to earlier periods to see how all the ideas are being laid down, because I think they don't change very much over the centuries in some ways. And just keep an eye on how this maps onto the growing amounts of data available to us. I probably don't have time to talk about the research that I'm doing that attempts to do this by looking at the states of Eurasia and the sorts of ideologies that they're using to distinguish themselves from the pagans and the barbarians. But one thing I do want to point to is the role of the Roman Church in Western Europe to this. This is a church that's very much connected with society in its sort of sense of both dominion over nature, but I think really importantly, removal of oneself from nature, removal of oneself from the world, so disdain for the world, monasticism, expecting when the world ends that there should be a new Jerusalem, that a better earth will come, that this is not the place that you should invest your affections. You leave your family, follow me. There's a whole kind of, there's all sorts of other things in the Bible as well, but the things that are focused on by this church for this population tend to concern either dominion over the world or more often disdain for the world. And I think also an intrusion into the world. So the other thing that Gerald of Wales was talking about was how nature could be tamed by the church. And there's this long and strange story about a werewolf who comes to a priest asking for the Eucharist. So by the time a werewolf wants the Eucharist before it dies, you know that you've pretty much got command of nature. And I think, just again, this sort of sense that the destruction of the world doesn't matter. In a sense, the destruction of the worldliness and the fleshiness in yourself is the way you can get closest to God. It's very difficult to overcome that sort of dislocation, and I wonder sometimes whether the kind of neoliberal ideologies about the self who works harder and harder for the state and disciplines oneself and is mindful, and is this kind of more of the same thing, moving away from a kind of embeddedness and embodiedness. So just very quickly, I'm seeing my red flashing thing. So I think just some quick conclusions about what we could do. I think in all societies, stories about the past are crafted to say something meaningful to the present and to shape the future. And I think history is an empirical subject, but it is also, and always has been, a set of stories that are useful, and I think we should use it. And I think our current view of the human past, because it always has been generated by very powerful interests, is still skewed towards very powerful global and national elite interests. And it still is about securing resources and organising populations accordingly. And so I think basically the new narratives must include rigorous critique of these concepts and frameworks and models, including the present bias. And I think finally, and this is something I'd really be interested in exploring with people if anyone is interested in it, I think it's really important to put history and other humanities subjects into dialogue with earth sciences. I don't think we can be here to be ancillary and to communicate your findings to the rest of the population. I think it needs to be much more of a dialogue in moving forward to developing political and cultural approaches to the sort of changes we need now. Thank you.
Also, thank you for that, Amanda. That was, very personally interesting to me, and I think thank you for coming, because I think that could be really revolutionary to many of us as scientists, so thank you. So we've got time for a few questions. So I saw this hand here go up very rapidly. Forestry Commission, what have you got to ask?
No, I hugely enjoyed that, and fascinated with the change from the narrative of empire to where we are now, which is the real question for history, and this discussion about the reaction to the environment. My question really was for you as a medieval historian, which is probably the two most interesting parts, unless you go back to sort of before man, interesting moments in our history of the so-called Dark Ages, when there was potentially climate catastrophe, which completely changed society. We had to completely reinvent ourselves through some very difficult circumstances. And then the Black Death in 1349, which completely restructured society, got rid of serfdom, all sorts of things flowed out of that. And that, interestingly, the two most fascinating events, really, in climate terms, really probably happened before 1500. And I just wondered how you are seeing that in terms of the sort of dialogue between history and scientists.
Well, the book that I mentioned about the collapse of the Roman Empire, linking it to climate change and disease, I have to say I got a bit of a kicking from scientists afterwards. And I'm not equipped particularly to say whether it's right or wrong. The thing that I want to do with my own research...
I think it's a bit early. I think there's later events, actually, during the the sort of 5th, 6th centuries that are quite catastrophic as well.
Yeah. I mean, I think the problem is that some of the science is still under development as well, and as historians, we're very ill-equipped to judge which bits of science is sort of safe to use and which bits are a bit less secure. But I mean, with the work that I want to do, I think it's very interesting that the administrative states of Europe and also the administrative turn of the church and this, what I've been describing as medieval is actually quite nicely correlated to what's called the medieval climate anomaly, which for Europe is a slightly warmer and more stable situation. But I'm very nervous about making too much of a link here, and certainly until I've thought about it a bit more. But I've got it very much in mind. I mean, I think and it also looks as if, in that period that you've referred to as the Dark Ages, as if, so that before the medieval climate anomaly, as if biodiversity increased around Europe and people may possibly have got healthier. There's a little bit of archaeological work to suggest that in the absence of empire. And I think that these are things that, if that's the sort of question you're asking, I think these are the things that are absolutely fascinating that need to be worked out a bit better.
We've got a question over here.
I would be very interested in your thoughts on David Hume's is-ought question. Why only 2.5 centuries ago it could be a question as to whether, and quite a revolutionary question, as to whether the way things were might not be as they were meant to be. How it was that not long after that, Edmund Burke, one of our leading politicians here, could be saying that, and William Wilberforce for that matter, that we should not try to combat poverty. Poverty was as it was meant to be. It was the lot of the poor.
Sorry, which bit of that was the question?
It's all the question, how we have changed so radically since then. What has changed our thinking so enormously?
Well, do you think our thinking has changed enormously? I mean, certainly people say slightly different things about the poor, but I'm not sure they're treated so differently.
I'm going to take one more question, Sander. Sorry, lots of people had questions, but...
Thank you very much for, I think, a really nice and detailed resume of some of the things that have been going on. My question is the following. Most of those empires have come to an end.
They have.
Now, is that going to happen again? Or if it is not, what are your reasons for assuming it will not?
I am pretty convinced it's going to come to an end. As a medievalist, I'm extremely good at apocalyptic thinking. I sort of have to try not to do it. It comes very naturally. But I mean, certainly when you look at the history of complex systems, they're very vulnerable, and ours is an awful lot more complex than any of the empires I've been talking about.
So sorry, I'm going to have to we're running over time already, so I'm trying to keep us reined in a little bit. So I'm going to, yeah.